Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Spectre here, another edition of Midnight Rider. Good to have you aboard here on this 5th day of June now. Burned through 5 months, almost halfway through the year 2021 already. Still enduring, still surviving, still getting the message out. Today on the broadcast, going to cover a Vanity Fair piece talking about the Fauxci COVID can of worms, as it were, and the lab leaks. It's going to be a fairly long piece here, so buckle up, get ready, get your popcorn, get your coffee in hand. May actually have to take a break in the middle, I don't know, depending on how long this thing goes. There's a lot to unpack with this guy, so that's exactly what we're going to do here today. And so stick around, I'll see you back here momentarily on the other side. Rule number 1. Power you have, we have. 2. Of your people. Rule number 3. Whenever possible. Rule 4. Make the enemy live up to its own book of rules. Rule number 5 is man's most potent weapon. Rule number 6. A good tactic is one your people enjoy. Rule number 7. Drags on too long, becomes a drag. Rule number 8. Keep the pressure on. Let up. Rule number 9. The terrifying. The major premise for tactics of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. Rule number 11. If you enough, it will push through and become a positive. Number 12. Successful attack, constructive alternative. 13. It, personalize it, and polarize it. Lest we forget, at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical. From all our legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and ends, or which is which. The did it so that he can lose. Been yet another PSA by breaking. Alright, welcome back everybody. Appreciate you tuning in here this afternoon. Looking out in chat here, cutting in and out. Yeah, I don't know why it does that, because it's not like I'm pulling off of the net or anything. That's actually direct fire right into my broadcasting software, right off my PC, so I don't know why it does that exactly. I don't know, temperamental, I guess, especially given that everything is now updated with all the latest and greatest updates as of late, so I don't know, and a fresh reboot on top of that, so I'll have to do a little investigation. Nonetheless, appreciate you guys tuning in. If you're on the YouTube side, good to have you aboard. We are up over on Twitch. We are over on DLive this afternoon, as well as Tiger Network. And not to be forgotten, we are over on Trovo as well as Vaughn Live. Should something happen, we always have those backup broadcast outlets as well. So again, if you're joining late here, just coming into the show this afternoon, I wanted to get into this piece right here. The lab leak theory, investigating Fauci's COVID can of worms. And it's a piece, very well written piece by Vanity Fair, delving into all of the nuts and bolts of the leak theory, as it were, much of which many of us have known for better than a year. Has taken the rest of the Mockingbird media to get caught up because we were castigated, we were censored, we were kicked off of various platforms for even thinking of putting that information out better than a year ago. And of course, you heard me talk about the zero hedge piece in that, dating clear back to February of last year. And of course, they got the boot off of @Jack's platform all the way until about July of last year, with not so much as an apology for being a little bit too truthful ahead of its time. And of course, you've heard me talk about this, mainly because the narrative was still being formed. And I think at this point, with the quote-unquote leak of the emails per Fauci, that was indeed the case. Matter of fact, they even referenced the zero hedge piece at that time. So that's what I want to break down here today. Again, this is going to be a lengthy piece, so sit back, relax, enjoy. I want to get this out there for posterity's sake, if nothing else. And of course, there's a lot to unpack because there's a lot of links to various emails and studies and things of that nature as well. So let's get into it. The lab leak theory, investigating Fauci's COVID can of worms, by Catherine Eben over at Vanity Fair. Says, throughout 2020, the notion that the novel coronavirus leaked from a lab was off limits. Those who dared to push for transparency say toxic politics and hidden agendas kept us in the dark. Aside from everything else that I just got done speaking of course. Well, the lab leak theory, inside the fight to uncover COVID-19's origins. Part one is a group called Drastic. Gilles Deminoff is a data scientist with the Bank of New Zealand in Auckland. He was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome 10 years ago and believes it gives him a professional advantage. I'm very good at finding patterns in data when other people see nothing, he says. Aha. And before I go further, obviously you'll recognize that many of us, I don't claim to have Asperger's, but definitely have an eye for detail. And yes, many of us can pick out these patterns. You don't necessarily have to be Asperger's syndrome or slightly autistic to see that if you've got a trained enough eye. It says early last spring, as cities worldwide were shutting down to halt the spread of COVID-19, Deminoff, 52, began reading up on the origins of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes the disease. The prevailing theory was that it had jumped from bats to some other species before making the leap to humans at a market in China, or so we were told, right? Where some of the earliest cases appeared in late 2019. The human wholesale market in the city of Wuhan is a complex of markets selling seafood, meat, fruit, and vegetables. A handful of vendors sold live wild animals, a possible source of the virus. That wasn't the only theory, though. Wuhan is also home to China's foremost coronavirus research laboratory. And of course, early on, we found out it was literally feet away. Not all that far. Definitely less than a mile. Less than a half a mile at that. Housing one of the world's largest collections of bat samples and bat virus strains. The Wuhan Institute of Virology's lead coronavirus researcher, Shi Zhengli, was among the first to identify horseshoe bats as the natural reservoirs for SARS-CoV, the virus that sparked an outbreak in 2002, killing 774 people and sickening more than 8,000 globally. After SARS, bats became a major subject of study for virologists around the world, and she became known in China as Batwoman for her fearless exploration of their caves to collect samples. More recently, she and her colleagues at the Wuhan Institute of Virology have performed high-profile experiments that made pathogens more infectious. Such research, known as gain-of-function, has generated heated controversy among virologists. To some people, it seemed natural to ask whether the virus causing the global pandemic had somehow leaked from one of the WIV's labs, a possibility she has strenuously denied. On February 19, 2020, The Lancet, among the most respected and influential medical journals in the world, published a statement that roundly rejected the lab leak hypothesis, effectively casting it as xenophobic cousin to climate change, denialism, and anti-vaxxism. Signed by 27 scientists, the statement expressed solidarity with all scientists and health professionals in China and asserted, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin." Let that sink in for a minute, because we're going to come back to that toward the end, obviously, as the now revealed Fauci emails tend to state otherwise, right? The Lancet statement effectively ended the debate over COVID-19's origins before it began. To Gilles Deminoff, following along from the sidelines, it was as if it had been nailed to the church doors, establishing the natural origin theory as orthodoxy. Everyone had to follow it. Everyone was intimidated. That set the tone. The statement struck Deminoff as totally non-scientific. To him, it seemed to contain no evidence or information, and so he decided to begin his own inquiry in a proper way with no idea of what he would find. And I suspect he's probably like the rest of us, myself included, who have documented a lot of these things along the way. I have no idea what I have per my archives to this day as it pertains to COVID, but I would venture to say it's probably up north of probably about 7,000, 7,500 articles or so since the start of this deal back late January of last year. Here we see the picture of Shi Zhengli, the Wuhan Institute of Virology's lead coronavirus researcher. Pretty famous picture, used in a lot of outlets and that thus far. It says Deminoff began searching for patterns in the available data, and it wasn't long before he spotted one. China's laboratories were said to be airtight, with safety practices equivalent to those in the U.S. and other developed countries. But Deminoff soon discovered that there had been 4 incidents of SARS-related lab breaches since 2004, 2 occurring at a top laboratory in Beijing. Due to overcrowding there, a live SARS virus that had been improperly deactivated had been moved to a refrigerator in a corridor. A graduate student then examined it in the electron microscope room and sparked an outbreak. Deminoff published his findings in a Medium post titled "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, a review of SARS lab escapes." By then, he had begun working with another armchair investigator, Rodolphe de Mastier, a laboratory project director based in Paris, who had previously studied and worked in China. De Mastier was busy debunking the notion that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was a, quote, laboratory at all. In fact, the WIV housed numerous laboratories that worked on coronaviruses. Only one of them has the highest biosafety protocol, BSL-4, in which researchers must wear full-body pressurized suits with independent oxygen. Others are designated BSL-3 and even BSL-2, roughly as secure as an American dentist's office. Having connected online, Deminoff and de Mastier began assembling a comprehensive list of research laboratories in China. As they posted their findings on Twitter, they were soon joined by others around the world. Some were cutting-edge scientists at prestigious research institutes. Others were science enthusiasts. Together, they formed a group called DRASTIC, short for Decentralized Radical Autonomous Search Team Investigating COVID-19. Their stated objective was to solve the riddle of COVID-19's origin. At times, it seemed that the only other people entertaining the lab leak theory were crackpots or political hacks, hoping to wield COVID-19 as a cudgel against China. President Donald Trump's former political advisor, Stephen Bannon, for instance, joined forces with an exiled Chinese billionaire named Guo Wengui to fuel claims that China had developed the disease as a bioweapon and purposefully unleashed it on the world. As proof, they paraded a Hong Kong scientist around right-wing media outlets until her manifest lack of expertise doomed the charade. With disreputable wingnuts on one side of them and scornful experts on the other, The drastic researchers often felt as if they were on their own in the wilderness, working on the world's most urgent mystery. They weren't alone, but investigators inside the U.S. government asking similar questions were operating in an environment that was as politicized and hostile to open inquiry as any Twitter echo chamber. When Trump himself floated the lab leak hypothesis last April, his divisiveness and lack of credibility made things more, not less, challenging for those seeking the truth. The drastic people are doing better research than the U.S. government, says David Asher, a former senior investigator under contract to the State Department. The question is, why? Well, anytime the government's involved, you're better off having somebody on the outside as independents or the other part of the populace doing that than anything by way of the government, because there's no incentive to do your best at all. Part 2 here says a can of worms. Since December 1st, 2019, the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 has infected more than 170 million people around the world and killed more than 3.5 million. To this day, we don't know how or why this novel coronavirus suddenly appeared in the human population. Answering that question is more than an academic pursuit. Without knowing where it came from, we can't be sure we're taking the right steps to prevent a recurrence. And yet, in the wake of the Lancet statement, and under the cloud of Donald Trump's toxic racism, which contributed to an alarming wave of anti-Asian violence in the U.S., one possible answer to this all-important question remained largely off-limits until the spring of 2021. Behind closed doors, however, national security and public health experts and officials across a range of departments in the executive branch were locked in high-stakes battles over what could and couldn't be investigated and made public. A months-long Vanity Fair investigation, interviews with more than 40 people, and a review of hundreds of pages of U.S. government documents, including internal memos, meeting minutes, and email correspondence, found that conflicts of interest stemming in part from large government grants supporting controversial virology research hampered the U.S. investigation into COVID-19's origin at every step. In one State Department meeting, officials seeking to demand transparency from the Chinese government say they were explicitly told by colleagues not to explore the Wuhan Institute of Virology's gain-of-function research because it would bring unwelcome attention to U.S. government funding of it. In an internal memo obtained by Vanity Fair, Thomas DiNanno, former acting assistant secretary of the State Department's Bureau of Arms Control, Verification and Compliance, wrote that staff from two bureaus, his own and the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation, quote-unquote, warned leaders within his bureau, quote, not to pursue an investigation into the origin of COVID-19, end quote, because it would open a can of worms if it continued. There are reasons to doubt the lab leak hypothesis. There is a long, well-documented history of natural spillovers leading to outbreaks, even when the initial and intermediate host animals have remained a mystery for months and years. And some expert virologists say the supposed oddities of the SARS-CoV-2 sequence have been found in nature. And here we see Dr. Robert Redfield, former director of the CDC, saying that he received death threats from fellow scientists after telling CNN he thought the virus likely escaped from a lab. But for most of the past year, the lab leak scenario was treated not simply as unlikely or even inaccurate, but as morally out of bounds. In late March, former Centers for Disease Control Director Robert Redfield received death threats from fellow scientists after telling CNN that he believed COVID-19 had originated in a lab. I was threatened and ostracized because I proposed another hypothesis, Redfield told Vanity Fair. I expected it from politicians. I didn't expect it from science. With President Trump out of office, it should be possible to reject his xenophobic agenda and still ask why. In all places in the world. Did the outbreak begin in a city with a laboratory housing one of the world's most extensive collection of bat viruses, doing some of the most aggressive research? Dr. Richard Ebright, Board of Governors Professor of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Rutgers University, said that from the very first reports of a novel bat-related coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, it took him, quote, a nanosecond or a picosecond, end quote, to consider a link to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Only 2 other labs in the world, in Galveston, Texas, and Chapel Hill, North Carolina, were doing similar research. It's not a dozen cities, he said. It's 3 places. Then came the revelation that the Lancet statement was not only signed, but organized by a zoologist named Peter Daszak, who has repackaged U.S. government grants and allocated them to facilities conducting gain-of-function research, among them the WIV itself. David Asher, now a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, ran the State Department's day-to-day COVID-19 origins inquiry. He said it soon became clear that, quote, there is a huge gain-of-function bureaucracy, end quote, inside the federal government. As months go by, without a host animal that proves a natural theory, the questions from credible doubters have gained in urgency. To one former federal health official, the situation boiled down to this. An institute, quote, funded by American dollars, is trying to teach a bat virus to infect human cells. Then there is a virus, end quote, in the same city as that lab. It is not being intellectually honest not to consider the hypothesis of a lab escape. And, given how aggressively China blocked efforts at a transparent investigation, and in light of its government's own history of lying, obfuscating, and crushing dissent, it's fair to ask if Shi Zhenglei, the Wuhan Institute's lead coronavirus researcher, wouldn't be at liberty to report a leak from her lab even if she'd wanted to. On May 26, the steady crescendo of questions led President Joe Biden to release a statement acknowledging that the intelligence community had, quote, coalesced around 2 likely scenarios, end quote, and announced that he had asked for a more definitive conclusion within 90 days. His statement noted, quote, the failure to get our inspectors on the ground in those early months will always hamper any investigation into the origin of COVID-19, end quote. But that wasn't the only failure. In the words of David Faith, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the East Asia Bureau, the story of why parts of the U.S. government were not as curious as many of us think they should have been is a hugely important one. Part 3 here says, smelled like a cover-up. On December 9th, 2020, roughly a dozen State Department employees from 4 different bureaus gathered in a conference room in Foggy Bottom to discuss an upcoming fact-finding mission to Wuhan, organized in part by the World Health Organization. The group agreed on the need to press China to allow a thorough, credible, and transparent investigation, with unfettered access to markets, hospitals, and government laboratories. The conversation then turned to the more sensitive question: what should the U.S. government say publicly about the Wuhan Institute of Virology? A small group within the State Department's Arms Control Verification and Compliance Bureau had been studying the institute for months. The group had recently acquired classified intelligence suggesting that 3 WIV researchers conducting gain-of-function experiments on coronavirus samples had fallen ill in the autumn of 2019, before the COVID-19 outbreak was known to have started. As officials in the meeting discussed what they could share with the public, they were advised by Christopher Park, the director of the State Department's Biological Policy Staff in the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation, not to say anything that would point to the U.S. government's own role in gain-of-function research, according to documentation of the meeting obtained by Vanity Fair. Some of the attendees were, quote, absolutely floored, end quote, said an official familiar with the proceedings. That someone in the U.S. government could, quote, make an argument that is so nakedly against transparency in light of the unfolding catastrophe was shocking and disturbing, end quote. Park, who in 2017 had been involved in lifting a U.S. government moratorium on funding for gain-of-function research, was not the only official to warn the State Department investigators against digging in sensitive places. As the group probed the lab leak scenario, Among other possibilities, its members were repeatedly advised not to open a, quote, Pandora's box, said 4 former State Department officials interviewed by Vanity Fair. The admonitions smelled like a cover-up, said Thomas Donano, and I wasn't going to be part of it. Reached for comment, Chris Park told Vanity Fair, quote, I am skeptical that people genuinely felt they were being discouraged from presenting facts, end quote. He added that he was simply arguing that it is making an enormous and unjustifiable leap to suggest that research of that kind meant that something untoward is going on. Part 4 says an antibody response. There were 2 main teams inside the U.S. government working to uncover the origins of COVID-19, one in the State Department and another under the direction of the National Security Council. No one at the State Department had much interest in Wuhan's laboratories at the start of the pandemic, but they were gravely concerned with China's apparent cover-up of the outbreak's severity. The government had shut down the Woohan market, ordered laboratory samples destroyed, claimed the right to review any scientific research about COVID-19 ahead of publication, and expelled a team of Wall Street Journal reporters. In January 2020, a Wuhan ophthalmologist named Li Wenling, who'd tried to warn his colleagues that the pneumonia could be a form of SARS, was arrested, accused of disrupting the social order, and forced to write a self-criticism. He died of COVID-19 in February, lionized by the Chinese public as a hero and whistleblower. You had Chinese government coercion and suppression, said David Feith of the State Department's East Asia Bureau. We were very concerned that they were covering it up, and whether the information coming to the World Health Organization was reliable. As questions swirled, Miles Yu, the State Department's principal China strategist, noted that the WIV had remained largely silent. Yu, who is fluent in Mandarin, began mirroring its website and compiling a dossier of questions about its research. In April, he gave his dossier to Secretary of State Pompeo, who in turn publicly demanded access to the laboratories there. It is not clear whether Yu's dossier made its way to President Trump, but on April 30, 2020, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence put out an ambiguous statement whose apparent goal was to suppress a growing furor around the lab leak theory. It said that the intelligence community concurs with the wide scientific consensus that the COVID-19 virus was not man-made or genetically modified, but would continue to assess whether the outbreak began through contact with infected animals or if it was a result of an accident at a laboratory in Wuhan. And here we see State Department official Thomas Donano wrote a memo charging that staff from his bureau were warned not to pursue an investigation into the origins of COVID-19. It was pure panic, said former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger. They were getting flooded with queries. Someone made the unfortunate decision to say, we basically know nothing, so let's put out the statement. Then the bomb thrower-in-chief weighed in. At a press briefing just hours later, Trump contradicted his own intelligence officials and claimed that he had seen classified information indicating that the virus had come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Asked what the evidence was, he said, I can't tell you that. I'm not allowed to tell you that. Trump's premature statement poisoned the waters for anyone seeking an honest answer to the question of where COVID-19 came from. According to Pottinger, there was an antibody response within the government, in which the discussion of a possible lab origin was linked to destructive nativist posturing. The revulsion extended to the international science community, whose maddening silence frustrated Miles Yu. He recalled, anyone who dares speak out would be ostracized. And Part 5, too risky to pursue. The idea of a lab leak first came to NSC officials not from hawkish Trumpists, but from Chinese social media users who began sharing their suspicions as early as January 2020. Then, in February, a research paper co-authored by 2 Chinese scientists based at separate Wuhan universities appeared online as a preprint. It tackled a fundamental question. How did a novel bat coronavirus get to a major metropolis of 11 million people in central China in the dead of winter when most bats were hibernating, and turn a market where bats weren't sold into the epicenter of an outbreak? Very good question, right? And I think that was one of the things that Zero Hedge at the time picked up on, and I think that paper was later recanted. The paper offered an answer. We screened the area around the seafood market and identified 2 laboratories conducting research on bat coronavirus. The first was the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which sat just 280 meters from the Hunan market and had been known to collect hundreds of bat samples. The second, the researchers wrote, was the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The paper came to a staggeringly blunt conclusion about COVID-19. The killer coronavirus probably originated from a laboratory in Wuhan. Regulations may be taken to relocate these laboratories far away from city center and other densely populated places. Almost as soon as the paper appeared on the internet, it disappeared, but not before U.S. government officials took note. By then, Matthew Pottinger had approved a COVID-19 origins team run by the NSC Directorate that oversaw issues related to weapons of mass destruction. A longtime Asia expert and former journalist, Pottinger purposefully kept the team small because there were so many people within the government, wholly discounting the possibility of a lab leak, who were predisposed that it was impossible, said Pottinger. In addition, many leading experts had either received or approved funding of gain-of-function research. Their conflicted status, said Pottinger, played a profound role in muddying the waters and contaminating the shot at having an impartial inquiry. Here we see Peter Daszak, who repackaged U.S. government grants and allocated the funds to research institutes, including the WIV. As they combed open sources as well as classified information, the team's members soon stumbled on a 2015 research paper by Shi Zhengli and the University of North Carolina epidemiologist Ralph Barrett, proving that the spike protein of a novel coronavirus could infect human cells. Using mice as subjects, they inserted the protein from a Chinese rufous horseshoe bat into the molecular structure of the SARS virus from 2002, creating a new infectious pathogen. This gain-of-function experiment was so fraught that the authors flagged the danger themselves, writing, "Scientific review panels may deem similar studies too risky to pursue." In fact, the study was intended to raise an alarm and warn the world of a potential risk of SARS-CoV reemergence from viruses currently circulating in bat populations. The paper's acknowledgment cited funding from the U.S. National Institute of Health and from a nonprofit called EcoHealth Alliance, which had parceled out grant money from the U.S. Agency for International Development. EcoHealth Alliance is run by Peter Daszak, the zoologist who helped organize the Lancet statement. That a genetically engineered virus might have escaped from the WIV was one alarming scenario, but it was also possible that a research trip to collect bat samples could have led to infection in the field or back at the lab. The NSC investigators found ready evidence the China labs were not as safe as advertised. Shi Zhengli herself had publicly acknowledged that, until the pandemic, all of her team's coronavirus research, some involving live SARS-like viruses, had been conducted in less secure BSL-3 and even BSL-2 laboratories. In 2018, a delegation of American diplomats visited the WIV for the opening of its BSL-4 laboratory, a major event. In an unclassified cable, as a Washington Post columnist reported, they wrote that a shortage of highly trained technicians and clear protocols threatened the facility's safe operations. The issues had not stopped the WIV's leadership from declaring the lab, quote, ready to research on Class 4 pathogens, among which are the most virulent viruses that pose a high risk of aerosolized person-to-person transmission, end quote. And here's an unclassified piece. We'll touch upon that here towards the end. On February 14th, 2020, to the surprise of NSC officials, President Xi Jinping of China announced a plan to fast-track a new biosecurity law to tighten safety procedures throughout the country's laboratories. Was this a response to confidential information? In the early weeks of the pandemic, it didn't seem crazy to wonder if this thing came out of a lab, Pottinger reflected. Apparently, it didn't seem crazy to Xi Zhengli either. A Scientific American article first published in March 2020, for which she was interviewed, described how her lab had been the first to sequence the virus in those terrible first weeks. It also recounted how she frantically went through her own lab's records from the past few years to check for any mishandling of experimental materials, especially during disposal. She breathed a sigh of relief when the results came back. None of the sequences matched those of the viruses her team had sampled from bat caves. That really took a load off my mind, she says. I had not slept a wink for days. As the NSC tracked these disparate clues, U.S. government virologists advising them flagged one study first submitted in April 2020. 11 of its 23 co-authors worked for the Academy of Military Medical Sciences, the Chinese Army's Medical Research Institute. Using the gene editing technology known as CRISPR, the researchers had engineered mice with humanized lungs, then studied their susceptibility to SARS-CoV-2. As the NSC officials worked backward from the date of publication to establish a timeline for the study, it became clear that the mice had been engineered sometime in the summer of 2019, before the pandemic even started. The NSC officials were left wondering, had the Chinese military been running viruses through humanized mouse models to see which might be infectious to humans? Believing they had uncovered important evidence in favor of the lab leak hypothesis, the NSC investigators began reaching out to other agencies. That's when the hammer came down. We were dismissed, said Anthony Ruggiero, the NSC's Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense. The response was very negative. And keep in mind, what else happened in that time frame in 2019? Do you remember? A little Event 201 simulation in October. So let's say, if you look at this timeline, right, this is the summer where they think that all this study with mice took place. All of a sudden, October, they run a simulation, and wop babaloo bop, here comes December, the first case, and then January 15th, shortly after Pelosi walked the papers over for the impeachment proceedings to the Senate, same day, voila, we get our first case here in the United States up in the Northwest. Believing they had uncovered important evidence, okay, we covered that part. All right, so part 6, sticklers for accuracy. By the summer of 2020, Gilles Deminoff was spending up to 4 hours a day researching the origins of COVID-19, joining Zoom meetings before dawn with European collaborators, and not sleeping much. He began to receive anonymous calls and noticed strange activity on his computer, which he attributed to Chinese government surveillance. We are being monitored for sure, he says. He moved his work to the encrypted platforms Signal and Proton Mail. As they posted their findings, the drastic researchers attracted new allies. Among the most prominent was Jamie Metzel, who launched a blog on April 16th that became a go-to site for government researchers and journalists examining the lab leak hypothesis. A former executive vice president of the Asia Society, Metzel sits on the World Health Organization's Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing and served in the Clinton administration as the NSC's Director for Multilateral Affairs. In his first post on the subject, he made clear that he had no definitive proof and believed that Chinese researchers at the WIV had the, quote, best intentions. Meitzel also noted, in no way do I seek to support or align myself with any activities that may be considered unfair, dishonest, nationalistic, racist, bigoted, or biased in any way. On December 11, 2020, Deminoff, a stickler for accuracy, reached out to Metzel to alert him to a mistake on his blog. The 2004 SARS lab escape in Beijing, Deminoff pointed out, had led to 11 infections, not 4. Deminoff was, quote, impressed by Meitzel's immediate willingness to correct the information. From that time, we started working together. Meitzel, in turn, was in touch with the Paris Group, a collective of more than 30 skeptical scientific experts who met by Zoom once a month for hours-long meetings to hash out emerging clues. Before joining the Paris Group, Dr. Philippa Lentzos, a biosecurity expert at King's College London, had pushed back online against wild conspiracies. No, COVID-19 was not a bioweapon used by the Chinese to infect American athletes at the Military World Games in Wuhan in October 2019. But the more she researched, the more concerned she became that not every possibility was being explored. On May 1, 2020, she published a careful assessment in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, describing just how a pathogen could have escaped the Wuhan Institute of Virology. She noted that a September 2019 paper in an academic journal by the director of the WIV's BSL-4 laboratory, Wang Jiming, had outlined safety deficiencies in China's labs. Maintenance cost is generally neglected, he had written. Some BSL-3 laboratories run on extremely minimal operational costs, or in some cases, none at all. Anita Chan, a young molecular biologist and postdoctoral fellow at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard University, found that early sequences of the virus showed very little evidence of mutation. Had the virus jumped from animals to humans, one would expect to see numerous adaptations, as was true in the 2002 SARS outbreak. To Chan, it appeared that SARS-CoV-2 was already, quote, pre-adapted to human transmission, she wrote in a preprint paper in May 2020. But perhaps the most startling find was made by an anonymous drastic researcher, known on Twitter as @TheSeeker268. The Seeker, as it turns out, is a young former science teacher from eastern India. He had begun plugging keywords into the China National Knowledge Infrastructure, a website that houses papers from 2,000 Chinese journalists, and running the results through Google Translate. One day, last May, he finished up a thesis from 2013 written by a master's student in Kunming, China. The thesis opened an extraordinary window into a bat-filled mine shaft in Yunnan province and raised sharp questions about what Xi Zhengli had failed to mention in the course of making her denials. In Part 7, the Mojing Miners. In 2012, 6 miners in the lush mountains of Mojing County in southern Yunnan province were assigned an unenviable task to shovel out a thick carpet of bat feces from the floor of a mine shaft. After weeks of dredging up bat guano, the miners became gravely ill and were sent to the first affiliated hospital at the Kunming Medical University in Yunnan's capital. Their symptoms of cough, fever, and labored breathing rang alarm bells in a country that had suffered through a viral SARS outbreak a decade earlier. The hospital called in pulmonologist Zhang Nanshan, who had played a prominent role in treating SARS patients and would go on to lead an expert panel for China's National Health Commission on COVID-19. Zhang, according to the 2013 master's thesis, immediately suspected a viral infection. He recommended a throat culture and an antibody test, but he also asked what kind of bat had produced the guano. The answer? The rufous horseshoe bat, the same species implicated in the first SARS outbreak. Within months, 3 of the 6 miners were dead. The eldest, who was 63, died first. The disease was acute and fierce, the thesis noted. It concluded the bat that caused the 6 patients to fall ill was a Chinese rufous horseshoe bat. Blood samples were sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which found that they were positive for SARS antibodies, a later Chinese dissertation documented. And here we see a picture, a memorial for Dr. Li Wenling, who was celebrated as a whistleblower in China after sounding the alarm about COVID-19 in January 2020. But there was a mystery at the heart of the diagnosis. Bat coronaviruses were not known to harm humans. What was so different about the strains from inside the cave? To find out, teams of researchers from across China and beyond traveled to the abandoned mine shaft to collect viral samples from bats, musk shrews, and rats. In an October 2013 Nature study, Shi Zhengli reported a key discovery that certain bat viruses could potentially infect humans without first jumping to an intermediate animal. By isolating a live SARS-like bat coronavirus for the first time, her team had found that it could enter human cells through a protein called the ACE2 receptor. In subsequent studies in 2014 and 2016, she and her colleagues continued studying samples of bat viruses collected from the mine shaft, hoping to figure out which one had infected the miners. The bats were bristling with multiple coronaviruses, but there was only one whose genome closely resembled SARS. The researchers named it RABT-CoV4991. On February 3, 2020, with the COVID-19 outbreak already spreading beyond China, Shi Zhengli and several colleagues published a paper noting that the SARS-CoV-2 virus's genetic code was almost 80% identical to that of SARS-CoV, which caused the 2002 outbreak. But they also reported that it was 96.2% identical to a coronavirus sequence in their possession called RATG13, which was previously detected in Yunnan province. They concluded the RATG13 was the closest known relative to SARS-CoV-2. In the following months, as researchers around the world hunted for any known bat virus that might be a progenitor of SARS-CoV-2, Shi Zhengli offered shifting and sometimes contradictory accounts of where RATG13 had come from and when it was fully sequenced. Searching a publicly available library of genetic sequences, several teams, including a group of drastic researchers, soon realized that RATG appeared identical to RABT-CoV4991, the virus from the cave where the miners fell ill in 2012 with what looked like COVID-19. In July, as questions mounted, Shi Zhengli told Science magazine that her lab had renamed the sample for clarity, but to skeptics, the renaming exercise looked like an effort to hide the sample's connection to the Mojing mine. Their questions multiplied the following month when Shi, Dachik, and their colleagues published an account of 630 novel coronaviruses they had sampled between 2010 and 2015. Combing the supplementary data, drastic researchers were stunned to find 8 more viruses from the Mojing mine that were closely related to RATG13, but had not been flagged in the account. Alina Chan of the Broad Institute said it was mind-boggling that these crucial puzzle pieces had been buried without comment. In October 2020, as questions about the Mojing mine shaft intensified, a team of journalists from the BBC tried to access the mine itself. They were tailed by plainclothes police officers and found the road conveniently blocked by a broken-down truck. She, by now facing growing scrutiny from the International Press Corps, told the BBC, quote, "I've just downloaded the Kunming Hospital University student's master's thesis and read it. The conclusion is neither based on evidence nor on logic, but it's used by conspiracy theorists to doubt me. If you were me, what would you do?" Part 8. The Gain of Function Debate. On January 3, 2020, Dr. Robert Redfield, director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, got a phone call from his counterpart Dr. George Fu Guo, head of the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Gao described the appearance of a mysterious new pneumonia, apparently limited to people exposed at a market in Wuhan. Redfield immediately offered to send a team of specialists to help investigate. But when Redfield saw the breakdown of early cases, some of which were family clusters, the market explanation made less sense. Had multiple family members gotten sick via contact with the same animal? Gao assured him there was no human-to-human transmission, says Redfield, who nevertheless urged him to test more widely in the community. That effort prompted a tearful return call. Many cases had nothing to do with the market, Gao admitted. The virus appeared to be jumping from person to person, a far scarier scenario. And here we see former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger said the conflicted status of leading experts who had either approved or received funding for gain-of-function research, quote, played a profound role in muddying the waters. Carrying on, Redfield immediately thought of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. A team could rule it out as a source of the outbreak in just a few weeks by testing researchers there for antibodies. Redfield formally reiterated his offer to send specialists, but Chinese officials didn't respond to his overture. Redfield, a virologist by training, was suspicious of the WIV in part because he had been steeped in the years-long debate over gain-of-function research. The debate engulfed the virology community in 2011 after Ron Fauxci, a researcher at the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, announced that he had genetically altered the H5N1 avian influenza strain to make it transmissible among ferrets, who are genetically closer to humans than mice. Fauxci calmly declared that he'd produced probably one of the most dangerous viruses you could make. In the ensuing uproar, scientists battled over the risks and benefits of such research. Those in favor claimed it could help prevent pandemics by highlighting potential risks and accelerating vaccine development. Critics argued that creating pathogens that didn't exist in nature ran the risk of unleashing them. In October 2014, the Obama administration imposed a moratorium on new funding for gain-of-function research projects that could make influenza, MERS, or SARS viruses more virulent or transmissible. But a footnote to the statement announcing the moratorium carved out an exception for cases deemed, quote, urgently necessary to protect the public health or national security, end quote. In the first year of the Trump administration, the moratorium was lifted and replaced with a review system called the HHS P3CO framework for potential pandemic pathogen care and oversight. It put the onus for ensuring the safety of any such research on the federal department or agency funding it. This left the review process shrouded in secrecy. The names of reviewers are not released, and the details of the experiments to be considered are largely secret, said the Harvard epidemiologist Dr. Mark Lipsitch, whose advocacy against gain-of-function research helped prompt the moratorium. Footnote here says an NIH spokesperson told Vanity Fair that information about individual unfunded applications is not public to preserve confidentiality and protect sensitive information, preliminary data, and intellectual property. Inside the NIH, which funded such research, the P3CO framework was largely met with shrugs and eye rolls, said a longtime agency official. If you ban gain-of-function research, you ban all of virology, he added. Ever since the moratorium, everyone's gone wink-wink and just done gain-of-function research anyway. British-born Peter Daszak, 55, is the president of EcoHealth Alliance, a New York City-based nonprofit with the laudable goal of preventing the outbreak of emerging diseases by safeguarding ecosystems. In May 2014, 5 months before the moratorium on gain-of-function research was announced, EcoHealth secured a NIAID grant of roughly $3.7 million, which it allocated in part to various entities engaged in collecting bat samples, building models, and performing gain-of-function experiments to see which animal viruses were able to jump to humans. The grant was not halted under the moratorium or the P3CO framework. By 2018, EcoHealth Alliance was pulling in up to $15 million a year in grant money from an array of federal agencies, including the Defense Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. According to 990 tax exemption forms it filed with the New York State Attorney General's Charities Bureau. Xi Zhengli herself listed U.S. government grant support of more than $1.2 million on her curriculum vitae, $665,000 from the NIH between 2014 and 2019, and $559,500 over the same period from USAID. At least some of these funds were routed through EcoHealth Alliance. EcoHealth Alliance's practice of divvying up large government grants into smaller sub-grants for individual labs and institutions gave it enormous sway within the field of virology. The sums at stake allow it to purchase a lot of omerta, from the labs it supports, said Dr. Richard Ebright of Rutgers. In response to detailed questions on EcoHealth Alliance, spokesperson said on behalf of the organization in Dachik, "We have no comment." As the pandemic raged, the collaboration between EcoHealth Alliance and the WIV wound up in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. At a White House COVID-19 press briefing on April 17, 2020, a reporter from the conspiratorial right-wing media outlet Newsmax asked Trump a factually inaccurate question about a $3.7 million NIH grant to a level 4 lab in China. Why would the U.S. give a grant like that to China? The reporter asked. Trump responded, "We will end that grant very quickly," adding, "Who was president then? I wonder." A week later, an NIH official notified Dachik in writing that his grant had been terminated. The order had come from the White House. Dr. Anthony Fauci later testified before a congressional committee. The decision fueled a firestorm. 81 Nobel laureates in science denounced the decision in an open letter to Trump health officials. And 60 Minutes ran a segment focused on the Trump administration's short-sighted politicization of science. Dachik appeared to be the victim of a political hit job, orchestrated to blame China, Dr. Fauci, and scientists in general for the pandemic, while distracting from the Trump administration's bungled response. He's basically a wonderful, decent human being and an old-fashioned altruist, said the NIH official. To see this happening to him, it really kills me. And again, we'll hit this letter toward the end here. But in July, the NIH attempted to backtrack. It reinstated the grant but suspended its research activities until EcoHealth Alliance fulfilled 7 conditions, some of which went beyond the nonprofit's purview and seemed to stray into tinfoil hat territory. They included providing information on the apparent disappearance of a Wuhan Institute of Virology researcher, who was rumored on social media to be patient 0, and explaining diminished cell phone traffic and roadblocks around the WIV in October 2019. But conspiracy-minded conservatives weren't the only ones looking askance at Dachik. Ebright likened Dachik model of research, bringing samples from a remote area to an urban one, then sequencing and growing viruses and attempting to genetically modify them to make them more virulent, to look for a gas leak with a lighted match. Moreover, Ebright believed that Dachik's research had failed in its stated purpose of predicting and preventing pandemics through its global collaborations. It soon emerged, based on emails obtained by a Freedom of Information group called U.S. Right to Know, that Dachik had not only signed but organized the influential Lancet statement with the intention of concealing his role and creating the impression of a scientific unanimity. Under the subject line, "No need for you to sign the statement, Ralph," he wrote to 2 scientists, including UNC's Dr. Ralph Barrick, who had collaborated with Xi Zhengli on the gain-of-function study that created a coronavirus capable of infecting human cells. Quote, "You, me, and him should not sign the statement, so it has some distance from us and therefore doesn't work in a counterproductive way," end quote, Dachik added. We'll then put it out in a way that doesn't link it back to our collaboration, so we maximize an independent voice. Barrick agreed, writing back, "Otherwise it looks self-serving, and we lose impact." Barrick did not sign the statement. In the end, Dachik did. At least 6 other signers had either worked at or had been funded by EcoHealth Alliance. The statement ended with a declaration of objectivity. "We declare no competing interests." Dachik mobilized so quickly for a reason, said Jamie Metzel. If zoologist was the origin, it was a validation of his life work. But if the pandemic started as part of a lab leak, it had the potential to do to virology what 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl did to nuclear science. It could mine the field indefinitely in moratoriums and funding restrictions. Part 9, the dueling memos. Bear with me here. There we go. By the summer of 2020, the State Department's COVID-19 origins investigation had gone cold. Officials in the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance went back to their normal work, surveilling the world for biological threats. We weren't looking for Wuhan, said Thomas Donano. That fall, the State Department's team got a tip from a foreign source. Key information was likely sitting in the U.S. intelligence community's own files, unanalyzed. In November, that lead turned up classified information that was, quote, absolutely arresting and shocking, end quote, said a former State Department official. 3 researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, all connected with gain-of-function research on coronaviruses, had fallen ill in November 2019 and appeared to have visited the hospital with symptoms similar to COVID-19, 3 government officials told Vanity Fair. While it is not clear what had sickened them, these were not the janitors, said the former State Department official. They were active researchers. The dates were among the absolute most arresting part of the picture, because they are smack where they could be if this was the origin. The reaction inside the State Department was, holy shit. One former senior official recalled, we should probably tell our bosses. The investigation roared back to life. An intelligence analyst working with David Asher sifted through classified channels and turned up a report that outlined why the lab leak hypothesis was plausible. It had been written in May by researchers at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which performs national security research for the Department of Energy. But it appeared to have been buried within the classified collections system. Here we see Jamie Metzel's blog became a go-to site for government researchers and journalists examining the lab leak hypothesis. Carrying on. Now the officials were beginning to suspect that someone was actually hiding materials supportive of a lab leak explanation. Why did my contractor have to pore through documents? Donano wondered. Their suspicion intensified when Department of Energy officials overseeing the Lawrence Livermore lab unsuccessfully tried to block the State Department investigators from talking to the report's authors. Their frustration crested in December when they finally briefed Chris Ford, acting Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. He seemed so hostile to their probe that they viewed him as a blinkered functionary bent on whitewashing China's malfeasance. But Ford, who had years of experience in nuclear non-proliferation, had long been a China hawk. Ford told Vanity Fair that he saw his job as protecting the integrity of any inquiry into COVID-19's origins that fell under his purview, going with, quote, stuff that makes us look like crackpot brigade, would backfire, he believed. There was another reason for his hostility. He'd already heard about the investigation from interagency colleagues rather than from the team itself, and the secrecy left him with a spidey sense that the process was a form of creepy freelancing. He wondered, had someone launched an unaccountable investigation with the goal of achieving a desired result? He was not the only one with concerns, as one senior government official with knowledge of the State Department's investigation said. They were writing this for certain customers in the Trump administration. We asked for the reporting behind the statements that were made. It took forever. Then you'd read the report. It would have this reference to a tweet and a date. It was not something you could go back and find. After listening to the investigators' findings, a technical expert in one of the State Department's bioweapons offices thought they were bonkers, Ford recalled. The State Department's team, for its part, believed that Ford was the one trying to impose a preconceived conclusion that COVID-19 had a natural origin. A week later, one of them attended the meeting where Christopher Park, who worked under Ford, advised those present not to draw attention to U.S. funding of gain-of-function research. With deep distrust simmering, the State Department's team convened a panel of experts to confidentially red team the lab leak hypothesis. The idea was to pummel the theory and see if it still stood. The panel took place on the evening of January 7th, one day after the insurrection at the Capitol. By then, Ford had announced his plan to resign. 29 people logged in to a secure State Department video call that lasted 3 hours, according to meeting minutes obtained by Vanity Fair. The scientific experts included Ralph Barrick, Alina Chan, and the Stanford microbiologist David Relman. Asher invited Dr. Stephen Quay, a breast cancer specialist who'd founded a biopharmaceutical company, to present a statistical analysis weighing the probability of a lab origin versus a natural one. Scissoring Quay's analysis, Barrick noted that its calculations failed to account for the millions of bat sequences that exist in nature but remain unknown. When a State Department advisor asked Quay whether he'd ever done a similar analysis, he replied, "There's a first time for everything," according to the meeting minutes. Though they questioned Quay's findings, the scientists saw other reasons to suspect a lab origin. Part of the WIV's mission was to sample the natural world and provide early warnings of human-capable viruses, said Relman. The 2012 infections of 6 miners was, quote, "worthy of banner headlines at the time," end quote, yet those causes had never been reported to the WHO. Barrick added that, if SARS-CoV-2 had come from a strong animal reservoir, one might have expected to see, quote, "multiple introduction events," end quote, rather than a single outbreak, though he cautioned that it didn't prove this was an escape from a laboratory. That prompted Asher to ask, could this not have been partly bioengineered? Ford was so troubled by what he viewed as the panel's weak evidence and the secretive inquiry that preceded it that he stayed up all night, summarizing his concerns in a 4-page memo. After saving it as a PDF so it couldn't be altered, he emailed the memo to multiple State Department officials the next morning. And again, we'll highlight this toward the end here. Says in the memo, Ford criticized the panel's lack of data and added, "I would also caution you against suggesting that there is anything inherently suspicious and suggestive of biological warfare activity about People's Liberation Army involvement in the WIV on classified projects. It would be difficult to say that the military involvement in classified virus research is intrinsically problematic, since the U.S. Army has been deeply involved in virus research in the United States for many years." Yet another document we'll hit towards the end here. Thomas DiNanno sent back a 5-page rebuttal to Ford's memo the next day, January 9th, though it was mistakenly dated 12/9/21. He accused Ford of misrepresenting the panel's efforts and enumerated the obstacles his team had faced: apprehension and contempt from the technical staff, warnings not to investigate the origins of COVID-19 for fear of opening a, quote, "can of worms," and a complete lack of responses to briefings and presentations. He added that Quay had been invited only after the National Intelligence Council failed to provide statistical help. A year's worth of mutual suspicions had finally spilled out into dueling memos. The State Department investigators pushed on, determined to go public with their concerns. They continued a weeks-long effort to declassify information that had been vetted by the intelligence community. On January 15th, 5 days before President Joe Biden's swearing in, the State Department released a fact sheet about activity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, disclosing key information: that several researchers there had fallen ill with COVID-19-like symptoms in autumn 2019, before the first identified outbreak case, and that researchers there had collaborated on secret projects with China's military and, quote, engaged in classified research, including laboratory animal experiments, on behalf of the Chinese military since at least 2017, end quote. The statement withstood aggressive suspicion, as one former State Department official said, and the Biden administration has not walked it back. "I was very pleased to see Pompeo's statement come through," said Chris Ford. "I was so relieved that they were using real reporting that had been vetted and cleared." Part 10 here. A fact-finding mission to Wuhan. In early July, the World Health Organization invited the U.S. government to recommend experts for a fact-finding mission to Wuhan, a sign of progress in the long-delayed probe of COVID-19's origins. Questions about the WHO's independence from China, the country's secrecy, and the raging pandemic had turned the anticipated mission into a minefield of international grudges and suspicion. Within weeks, the U.S. government submitted 3 names to the WHO: an FDA veteran, a CDC epidemiologist, and an NIAID virologist. None were chosen. Instead, only one representative from the U.S. made the cut: Peter Daszak. It had been evident from the start that China would control who could come and what they could see. In July, when the WHO sent member countries a draft of the terms governing the mission, the PDF document was titled CHN and WHO Agreed Final Version, suggesting that China had pre-approved its contents. Part of the fault lay with the Trump administration, which had failed to counter China's control over the scope of the mission when it was being hammered out 2 months earlier. The resolution forged at the World Health Assembly called not for a full inquiry into the origins of the pandemic, but instead for a mission, quote, to identify the zoonotic source of the virus, end quote. The natural origin hypothesis was baked into the enterprise. It was a huge difference that only the Chinese understood, said Jamie Metzel. While the Trump administration was huffing and puffing, some really important things were happening around the WHO, and the U.S. didn't have a voice. Here we see, in 2012, the prominent pulmonologist Zhang Nanshan consulted on a case of miners who fell ill after digging bat feces out of a cave in Mojing County. And of course, her symptoms of cough, fever, and labored breathing recalled the 2002 SARS outbreak, but also foreshadowed the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, on January 14th, 2021, Daszak and 12 other international experts arrived in Wuhan to join 17 Chinese experts and an entourage of government minders. They spent 2 weeks of the month-long mission quarantined in their hotel rooms. The remaining 2-week inquiry was more propaganda than probe, complete with a visit to an exhibit extolling President Xi's leadership. The team saw almost no raw data, only the Chinese government's analysis of it. They paid one visit to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they met with Xi Zhengli, as recounted in an annex to the mission report. One obvious demand would have been access to the WIV's database of some 22,000 virus samples and sequences, which had been taken offline. At an event convened by a London organization on March 10th, Daszak was asked whether the group had made such a request. He said there was no need. Xi Zhengli had stated that the WIV took down the database due to hacking attempts during the pandemic. Absolutely reasonable, Daszak said, and we did not ask to see the data. As you know, a lot of this work has been conducted with EcoHealth Alliance. We do basically know what's in those databases. There is no evidence of viruses closer to SARS-CoV-2 than RATG13 in those databases. Simple as that. In fact, the database had been taken offline on September 12, 2019, 3 months before the official start of the pandemic, a detail uncovered by Gilles Deminoff and 2 of his drastic colleagues. After 2 weeks of fact-finding, the Chinese and international experts concluded their mission by voting with a show of hands on which origin scenario seemed most probable. Direct transmission from bat to human, possible to likely. Transmission through an intermediate animal, likely to very likely. Transmission through frozen food, possible. Transmission through a laboratory incident, extremely unlikely. On March 30th, 2021, media outlets around the world reported on the release of the mission's 120-page report. Discussion of a lab leak took up less than 2 pages, calling the report fatally flawed. Jamie Metzel tweeted, "They set out to prove one hypothesis, not fairly examine all of them." The report also recounted how Xi rebutted conspiracy theories and told the visiting team of experts that there had been no reports of unusual diseases, none diagnosed, and all staff tested negative for SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. Her statement directly contradicted the findings summarized in the January 15 State Department fact sheet. There was a woeful lie. That was a woeful lie by people who know it's not true, said a former national security official. and yet another piece we'll cover toward the end here, says an internal U.S. government analysis of the mission's report obtained by Vanity Fair found it to be inaccurate and even contradictory, with some sections undermining conclusions made elsewhere and others relying on reference papers that had been withdrawn. Regarding the 4 possible origins, the analysis stated the report does not include a description of how these hypotheses were generated, would be tested, or how a decision would be made between them to decide that one is more likely than another. It added a possible laboratory incident received only a, quote, cursory look, and the evidence presented seems insufficient to deem the hypothesis extremely unlikely. The report's most surprising critic was WHO's director himself, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus of Ethiopia. With the credibility of the World Health Organization on the line, he appeared to acknowledge the report's shortcomings at a press event the day of its release. As far as WHO is concerned, all hypotheses remain on the table, he said. We have not yet found the source of the virus, and we must continue to follow the science and leave no stone unturned as we do. His statement reflected monumental courage, said Metzel. Tedros risked his entire career to defend the integrity of the World Health Organization. And of course, the WHO declined to make Tedros available for an interview. By then, an international coalition of roughly 24 scientists, among them drastic researcher Gilles Deminoff and eco-health critic Richard Ebright at Rutgers, had found a way around what Metzel described as a wall of rejections by scientific journals. With Metzel's guidance, they began publishing open letters in early March. The second letter, issued on April 7th, condemned the mission report and called for a full investigation into the origin of COVID-19. It was picked up widely by national newspapers. A growing number of people were demanding to know what exactly had gone on inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Were the claims in the State Department's fact sheet of sick researchers and secret military research accurate? Metzel had managed to question Xi directly a week before the release of the mission report. At a March 23rd online lecture by Xi, hosted by Rutgers Medical School, Metzel asked if she had full knowledge of all the research being done at the WIV and all the viruses held there, and if the U.S. government was correct that classified military research had taken place. She responded, our research is open, and we have a lot of international collaboration. And from my knowledge, all our research work is open, is transparency. So, at the beginning of COVID-19, we heard the rumors that it's claimed in our laboratory we have some project, blah blah, with Army, blah blah, these kinds of rumors. But this is not correct, because I am the lab's director and responsible for research activity. I don't know any kind of research work performed in this lab. This is incorrect information. A major argument against the lab leak theory hinged on the presumption that she was telling the truth when she said the WIV was not hiding any virus samples that are closer cousins to SARS-CoV-2. In Metzel's view, if she was lying about the military's involvement, or anything else, then all bets were off. Part 11. Inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In January 2019, the Wuhan Institute of Virology issued a press release hailing Xi Zhengli's distinguished and pioneering achievement in discovery and characterization of important bat-borne viruses. The occasion was her election as a Fellow of the prestigious American Academy of Microbiology, just the latest milestone in a glittering scientific career. In China, the celebrated Batwoman was easily recognizable from photos showing her in a full-body positive pressure suit inside the WIV's BSL-4 lab. She was a fixture at international virology conferences, thanks to her state-of-the-art work, said James de Leduc, the longtime director of the BSL-4 Galveston National Laboratory in Texas. At the international meetings he organized, she was a regular, along with Ralph Barrick from UNC. She's a charming person, completely fluent in English and French, said Leduc, sounding almost wistful. he added. This is how science works. You get everyone together, they share their data, go out and have a beer. Xi's journey to the top of the virology field had begun with treks to remote bat caves in southernmost China. In 2006, she trained at the BSL-4 Jean Metro Inserum Lab in Lyon, France. She was named director of the WIV Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases in 2011, and its BSL-3 lab director in 2013. It's hard to think of anyone, anywhere, who is better prepared to meet the challenge of COVID-19, and on December 30th, 2019, at around 7 p.m., she received a call from her boss, the director of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, according to an account she gave to the Scientific American. He wanted her to investigate several cases of patients hospitalized with a mysterious pneumonia. Drop whatever you are doing and deal with it now. The next day, by analyzing 7 patient samples, her team became one of the first to sequence and identify the ailment as a novel SARS-related coronavirus. By January 21st, she had been appointed to lead the Hubei Province COVID-19 Emergency Scientific Research Expert Group. At a terrifying moment in a country that exalted its scientists, she had reached a pinnacle. But her ascent came at a cost. There is reason to believe she was hardly free to speak her mind or follow a scientific path that didn't conform to China's party line. Though she had planned to share isolated samples of the virus with her friend James Leduc in Galveston, Beijing officials blocked her, and by mid-January a team of military scientists led by China's top virologist and biochemical expert Major General Shen Wei had set up operations inside the WIV. Under scrutiny from governments, including her own, with bizarre conspiracy theories and legitimate doubts swirling around her, she began lashing out at critics. The 2019 novel coronavirus is a punishment from nature for humanity's uncivilized habits, she wrote in a February 2nd post on WeChat, a popular social media app in China. I, Xi Zhengli, guarantee on my life that it has nothing to do with our lab. May I offer some advice to those people who believe and spread bad media rumors? Shut your dirty mouths. Though she has portrayed the WIV as a transparent hub of international research beset by false allegations, the State Department's January fact sheet painted a different picture of a facility conducting classified military research and hiding it, which she adamantly denies. But a former national security official who reviewed U.S. classified materials told Vanity Fair that inside the WIV, military and civilian researchers are doing animal research in the same freaking space. While that, in and of itself, does not prove a lab leak, Xi's alleged lies about it are absolutely material, said a former State Department official. It speaks to the honesty and credibility of the WIV that they kept this secret. You have a web of lies, coercion, and disinformation that is killing people. Vanity Fair sent Xi Zhengli and the director of the Wuhan Institute of Virology detailed questions. Neither responded to multiple requests for comments by email and phone. As officials at the NSC tracked collaborations between the WIV and military scientists, which stretch back 20 years, with 51 co-authored papers, they also took note of a book flagged by a college student in Hong Kong, written by a team of 18 authors and editors, 11 of whom worked at China's Air Force Medical University. The book, Unnatural Origin of SARS, a New Species of Man-Made Viruses as Genetic Bioweapons, explores issues surrounding the developments of bioweapon capabilities. Claiming that terrorists using gene editing had created SARS-CoV-1 as a bioweapon, the book contains some alarming practical tradecraft. Bioweapon aerosol attacks are best conducted during dawn, dusk, night, or cloudy weather, because ultraviolet rays can damage the pathogens. And it cited collateral benefits, noting that a sudden surge of hospitalizations could cause a healthcare system to collapse. One of the book's editors has collaborated on 12 scientific papers with researchers at the WIV. And here we see University of North Carolina virologist Ralph Barrick. The book's dramatic rhetoric could have been hyped by Chinese military researchers trying to sell books, or a pitch to the People's Liberation Army for funding to launch a biowarfare program. When a reporter with the Rupert Murdoch-owned newspaper, The Australian, published details from the book under the headline, Chinese-held talks on bioweapon benefits, the Global Times, a Chinese state-owned media outlet, ridiculed the article that the book was for sale on Amazon. The inflammatory idea of SARS-CoV-2 as bioweapon has gained traction as an alt-right conspiracy theory, but civilian research under Xi's supervision that has yet to be made public raises more realistic concerns. Xi's own comments to a science journal and grant information available on a Chinese government database suggest that in the past 3 years her team has tested 2 novel but undisclosed bat coronaviruses on humanized mice to gauge their infectiousness. In April 2021, in an editorial in the journal Infectious Diseases and Immunity, she resorted to a familiar tactic to contain the cloud of suspicion enveloping her. She invoked scientific consensus, just as the Lancet statement had. The scientific community strongly dismisses these unproven and misleading speculations and generally accepts the SARS-CoV-2 as a natural origin and was selected either in an animal before zoonotic transfer, or in humans following zoonotic transfer, she wrote. But Xi's editorial had no muzzling effect. On May 14th, in a statement published in Science magazine, 18 prominent scientists called for a transparent, objective investigation into COVID-19's origins, noting, "We must take hypotheses about both natural and laboratory spillovers seriously until we have sufficient data." Among the signers was Ralph Barrick. 15 months earlier, he had worked behind the scenes to help Peter Daszak stage manage the Lancet statement. The scientific consensus had been smashed to smithereens. Now, Part 12, Out of the Shadows. By spring of 2021, the debate over COVID-19's origins had become so nauseous that death threats were flying in both directions. In a CNN interview on March 26, Dr. Redfield, the former CDC director under Trump, made a candid admission. "I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory. Escaped." Redfield added that he believed the release was an accident, not an intentional act. In his view, nothing that happened since his first calls with Dr. Gao changed a simple fact. The WIV needed to be ruled out as a source, and it hadn't been. After the interview aired, death threats flooded his inbox. The vitriol came not just from strangers who thought he was being racially insensitive, but also from prominent scientists, some of whom used to be his friends. One said he should just wither and die. Peter Daszak was getting death threats too, some from QAnon conspirators. Of course, we gotta entangle the QAnon stuff into this, don't we? Good job, Vanity Fair. Inside the U.S. government, meanwhile, the lab leak hypothesis had survived the transition from Trump to Biden. On April 15th, Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines told the House Intelligence Committee that 2 plausible theories were being weighed: a lab accident or natural emergence. Even so, lab leak talk was mostly confined to right-wing news outlets through April, gleefully flogged by Tucker Carlson and studiously avoided by most of the mainstream media. In Congress, the Energy and Commerce Committee's Republican minority had launched its own inquiry, but there was little buy-in from Dems, and the NH didn't provide responses to its lengthy list of demands for information. The ground began to shift on May 2nd, when Nicholas Wade, a former New York Times science writer, known in part for writing a controversial book about how genes shape the social behavior of different races, published a lengthy essay on Medium. In it, he analyzed the scientific clues both for and against a lab leak, and excoriated the media for its failure to report on the dueling hypotheses. Wade devoted a full section to the furin cleavage site, a distinctive segment of SARS-CoV-2's genetic code that makes the virus more infectious by allowing it to efficiently enter human cells. Within the scientific community, one thing leapt off the page. Wade quoted one of the world's most famous microbiologists, Dr. David Baltimore, saying that he believed the furin cleavage site was the smoking gun for the origin of the virus. Baltimore, a Nobel laureate and pioneer in molecular biology, was about as far from Steve Bannon and the conspiracy theorists as it was possible to get. His judgment that the furin cleavage site raised the prospect of gene manipulation had to be taken seriously. With questions growing, NIH Director Dr. Francis Collins released a statement on May 19th asserting that neither NIH nor NIAID have ever approved any grant that would have supported gain-of-function research on coronaviruses that would have increased their transmissibility or lethality for humans. On May 24th, the World Health Organization's decision-making body, the World Health Assembly, kicked off a virtual edition of its annual conference. In the weeks leading up to it, a parade of high-profile stories broke, including 2 front-page reports in the Wall Street Journal and a long Medium post from a second former New York Times science reporter. Not surprisingly, China's government fired back during the conference, saying that it would not participate in further inquiries within its borders. On May 28th, 2 days after President Biden announced his 90-day intelligence review, the U.S. Senate passed a unanimous resolution, which Jamie Metzl had helped shape, calling on the World Health Organization to launch a comprehensive investigation into the origins of the virus. Will we ever know the truth? Dr. David Relman of Stanford University's School of Medicine has been advocating for an investigation like the 9/11 Commission to examine COVID-19's origins. But 9/11 took place in one day, he said, whereas this has so many different manifestations, consequences, responses across nations. All of that makes it a 100-dimensional problem. The bigger problem is that so much time has gone by. With every passing day and week, the kinds of information that might prove helpful will have a tendency to dissipate and disappear, he said. The world ages and things get moved, and biological signals degrade. China obviously bears responsibility for stonewalling investigators. Whether it did so out of sheer authoritarian habit or because it had a lab leak to hide is, and may always be, unknown. The United States deserves a healthy share of blame as well. Thanks to their unprecedented track record of mendacity and race baiting, Trump and his allies had less than zero credibility, and the practice of funding risky research via cutouts like EcoHealth Alliance enmeshed leading virologists in conflicts of interest at the exact moment that expertise was most desperately needed. Now, at least, there appears to be the prospect of a level inquiry, the kinds Jill Deminoff and Jamie Metzl had wanted from the start. We needed to create a space where all the hypotheses could be considered, Metzl said. If the lab leak explanation proves accurate, history may discredit Deminoff and his fellow doubters for breaking the dam, not that they have any intention of stopping. They are now knee-deep in examining the WIV's construction orders, sewage output, and cell phone traffic. The thought-driving Paris Group co-founder Virginie Courtier forward is simple. There are unanswered questions, she said, and a few human beings know the answers. And of course, additional reporting by Lily Pike with research assistance from Stan Friedman. So there you have it. The article, as it were, as penned by Vanity Fair, picked up by Zero Hedge, got about 150-some thousand views as of this now 5th day of June. I'm going to let this play through real quick, and then I'll be back to finish up with some of the details in that were within the article here, so stand by. Public Law 112-239, January 2nd, 2013, 126 Stat 1957. The General Authorization, Section 501A. The Secretary and the Broadcasting Board of Governors are authorized to use funds appropriated or otherwise made available for public diplomacy, information programs to provide for the preparation, dissemination, and use of information intended for foreign audiences abroad, the United States, its people, and its policies through press, motion pictures, the internet, and other information media, including social media, and through information centers, instructors, and other direct or indirect means of communication. Section 208, clarification on domestic distribution of program material. Rule of construction. Nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit the Department of State or the Broadcasting Board of Governors from engaging in any medium or form of communication, either directly or indirectly, because a United States domestic audience is or may be thereby exposed to program material, or based on a presumption of such exposure. Such material may be made available within the United States and disseminated, when appropriate, pursuant to Sections 502 and 1005 of the United States Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1948. 22 U.S.C. 1462 and 1437, except that nothing in this section may be construed to authorize the Department of State or the Broadcasting Board of Governors to disseminate within the United States any program material prepared for abroad on or before the effective date of Section 1078 of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2013. Welcome to the NDAA 2013. The groundwork is being laid. Flash forward to July 2013. Out of foreign policy, the U.S. repeals propaganda ban, spreads government-made news to Americans. For decades, a so-called anti-propaganda law prevented the U.S. government's mammoth broadcasting arm from delivering programming to American audiences, which of course led into House Resolution 5736, otherwise known as the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012, which legalized propaganda to be broadcast here within these United States, and signed into law by 44. December 2016, out of Zero Hedge, Obama quietly signs the Countering Disinformation and Propaganda Act into law. Our enemies are using foreign propaganda and disinformation against us and our allies, and so far the U.S. government has been asleep at the wheel. But today, with this bill, now law, we are finally signaling that enough is enough. And within that article, we get to find out about the NDAA of 2017, underneath Senate Bill 2943. In conjunction, we find out about House Resolution 5181, otherwise known as the Countering Foreign Propaganda Disinformation of 2016, also brought up in the Senate under 2692, called the Countering Information Warfare Act of 2016. All brought to us by the combination of the Portman-Murphy. The bill promotes the coordinated strategy to defend America, allies against propaganda and disinformation from Russia and China and others. And just like that, the U.S. Ministry of Truth is officially born. Well, not to be outdone, we gotta get big tech involved, right? Flash forward into September 2017. Why is Google hiring thousands of journalists to flood newsrooms around America? Well, I think we know the answer to that. It's a rhetorical question. And of course, Facebook to invest $300 million to help local news survive. All of that leading into the Communications Decency Act, otherwise known as Section 230 that we all know and love, 47 U.S. Code Section 230, protection for private blocking and screening of offensive material. A lot in the news about that here lately, and whether or not big tech can actually hide behind that, right? Flash forward into September 2019, out of Breitbart, Facebook, in court filings, defending itself from a lawsuit filed by activist and congressional candidate Laura Loomer, has cited its First Amendment right as a publisher, contradicting public claims by the company that its a social media service is a platform. Whoops. And of course, not to be outdone, Judicial Watch has this. Most of Facebook's censorship board has ties to left-wing billionaire George Soros. It's time to wake up, America. Our First Amendment is, has, and continues to be under assault. Realize, realize, realize. This has been a PSA by Breaking Spectre. Alright, welcome back everybody. If you are just joining, I just wrapped up in the first, about 90 so minutes of reading through the article here. You can rewind the tape, obviously, if you need to. Otherwise, you can catch it at the conclusion here and wait for everything to sequence up here, whether you're on the YouTube side, DLive side, wherever you may be watching this from. As part of this article, as I mentioned, there's a lot of bits and pieces to this to unpack, and so that's what I'm going to cover here, hopefully, and wrap up in about the next 30 minutes here. So stick with me on that. That being said, let's just get into it. The Lancet This was the piece net authored by everybody in net to kind of squelch the rumors and things of that nature at the onset of this, signed by a number of folks. And the statement in support of the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of China combating COVID-19. Here we see Charles Kellisher, Dennis Carroll, Rita Caldwell, Ronald P. Corley, Peter Dachik, Christian Drosten et al. That was put out on March 7th of 2020. And I'm not going to read all of this, but just to give you a little snippet of it, it says, we are public health scientists who have closely followed the emergence of 2019 novel coronavirus disease, the COVID-19, and are deeply concerned about its impact. Where'd I go here? And are deeply concerned about its impact on global health and well-being. There we go. We have watched as the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of China, in particular, have worked diligently and effectively to rapidly identify the pathogen behind this outbreak, put in place significant measures to reduce its impact, and share their results transparently with the global health community. This effort has been remarkable. We sign this statement in solidarity with all scientists and health professionals in China who continue to save lives and protect global health during the challenge of the COVID-19 outbreak. We are all in this together with our Chinese counterparts in the forefront against this new viral threat. And of course, again, some of the supplementary material in that there. By the way, again, if you're joining here, whether on a YouTube side, what have you, DLive, I dropped the link out there. You can find all of this information embedded within said article, so you can peruse that stuff at your leisure as well. That being said, one of the other things highlighted here is the article depicted. Some of the materials net here is one of the emails, unclassified, from January 19th, 2018. Looks like this is, let's see, who is this to? Beijing. Oh, it's from the Beijing Embassy to Washington, D.C., Secretary of State. So this must be one of the cables net that we briefly talked about. The summary and comment. The Chinese Academy of Sciences has recently established what is reportedly China's first biosafety level 4 BSL laboratory in Wuhan. This state-of-the-art facility is designed for prevention and control research on diseases that require the highest level of biosafety and biosecurity containment. Ultimately, scientists hope the lab will contribute to the development of new antiviral drugs and vaccines, but its current productivity is limited by a shortage of the highly trained technicians and investigators required to safely operate a BSL-4 laboratory, and a lack of clarity in related Chinese government policies and guidelines. And then, of course, a big bunch of that redacted there. Anyway, China in infectious disease control. Between November 2002 and July 2003, China faced an outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, which, according to the World Health Organization, resulted in 8,098 cases and leading to 774 deaths reported in 37 countries. Goes on to highlight the unclear guidelines on virus access and a lack of trained talent impede research. Also, few redactions in there. Despite limitations, WIV researchers produced SARS discoveries. And it appears this is signed off by Branstad, whoever that is, at the time. And that was one of the documents highlighted in the article as well. As far as the BioRxiv, SARS-CoV-2 is well adapted for humans. What does this mean for re-emergence? This appears to be penned. Let's see, when was this put out there? Trying to find the actual date. Oh, it looks like May 1st, 2020 right there. You can find that at https://doi.org, followed by all of this stuff. Again, this is highlighted in the article. The abstract states, is in a side-by-side comparison of evolutionary dynamics between the 2019-2020 SARS-CoV-2 and the 2003 SARS-CoV, we were surprised to find that the SARS-CoV-2 resembles SARS-CoV in the late phase of the 2003 epidemic, after SARS-CoV had developed several advantageous adaptations for human transmission. Our observations suggest that by the time SARS-CoV-2 was first detected in late 2019, it was already pre-adapted to human transmission, to an extent similar to late epidemic SARS-CoV. However, no precursors or branches of evolution stemming from a less human-adapted SARS-CoV-2-like virus have been detected. The sudden appearance of a highly infectious SARS-CoV-2 presents a major cause for concern that should motivate stronger international efforts to identify the source and prevent near-future reemergence. Any existing pools of SARS-CoV-2 progenitors would be particularly dangerous if similarly well adapted for human transmission. To look for clues regarding intermediate hosts, we analyze recent key findings related to how SARS-CoV-2 could have evolved and adapted for human transmission, and examine the environmental samples from the Wuhan Institute seafood market. Importantly, the market samples are genetically identical to human SARS-CoV-2 isolates and were, therefore, most likely from human sources. We conclude by describing and advocating for measured and effective approaches implemented in the 2002-2004 SARS outbreaks to identify lingering populations of progenitor virus. And of course, let's see, the paper in collection, SARS-CoV-2 preprints from MedRxiv and BioRxiv, etc. This was put out by Shanghai Zhan, Benjamin E. Deverman, and it looks to be Yujia Elena Chan, who is also referenced in the article. Carrying along, we also found this guy, the Department of Health and Human Services, email from July 8th, 2020. Drs. Zaleski Chimera and Peter Dachik from EcoHealth, talking about the NIH grant R01AI110964. Dear Drs. Chimera and Dachik, in follow-up to my previous letter of April 24th, 2020, I am writing to notify you that the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, an institute within the National Institutes of Health under the Department of Health and Human Services, has withdrawn its termination of grant R01AI110964, which supports the project Understanding the Risk of Bat Coronavirus Emergence. Accordingly, the grant is reinstated. So that would have been, as they alluded to in the article, under Trump. And again, I thought that, talking about the gain of function stuff, it had been put under moratorium. But again, looking at the actual date of this being last year, still under Trump at the time, somehow they were able to get a workaround to continue to advance that. And also highlighting another email here, presumably from the Fauci email dump, we get from Christopher Ford on Friday, January 8th, 2021. We see the various folks, David Stilwell, Stephen Bajan, Peter Berkowitz, and a few whose names have been scribbled out here. Good afternoon, all. We had a really valuable discussion yesterday evening with a fascinating panel of scientific experts organized by AVC on the question of the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It was something of a marathon session that lasted nearly 3 hours and produced important insights on a number of fronts. I wrote up a summary of the event last night and want to share it with all of you. I've attached it in line text below, as well as PDF of the same information. I didn't know what form will be most useful to you, so I adopted a belt and suspenders approach. It's a long document, but hopefully interesting, and the issues are important. And that was per Chris Ford, who again was mentioned in there as well, the Assistant Secretary for International Security and Non-Proliferation. And so here we can see his summary of January 7th, 2021, AVC panel discussion, origins of SARS-CoV-2 and the pandemic. I'm obviously not going to read through all of this. I'll quickly kind of scroll through it here, see if anything really sticks out. But I think in large part we covered a good chunk of that within the article. So there's 5 pages of that. Let's see. Carrying along, we also get response to former Assistant Secretary Ford's summary of January 7th, 2021 AVC panel discussion, origins of SARS-CoV-2 and the pandemic. Again, they stated in the article that for whatever reason this was backdated to December 9th, 2021, but these would be the competing memos and that were talked of, the one I just flashed versus this one. AVC is providing the following response in light of the fact that former Assistant Secretary Ford's memo was an inaccurate and misleading rendition of the event that mischaracterized the panel's exchanges and used references out of context. So, in effect, this is the rebuttal. A couple points to highlight here. I'll just hit the high points here. It says this event was not convened at the former Assistant Secretary's quote-unquote insistence. The panel was not convened to, quote, discuss arguments made by a contractor on AVC's payroll. Former Assistant Secretary Ford was briefed on AVC's initial classified and unclassified findings back on December 2nd. Since AVC's engagement with the interagency on this issue, the NIC has amended its previous assessment and is now much closer to AVC's initial findings, which did not accept the proposition of a natural occurrence of the virus to the exclusion of a lab escape possibility, despite the NIC's apparent refusal to consider a number of important technical and open source evidence. And they highlight the chronology of AVC interagency engagement attached. When former Assistant Secretary Ford implied agreement among panelists on various points, his summary mischaracterized the nature and content of the exchange of views. Carrying on, it says, AVC's findings to date have never included a non-published Bayesian statistical analysis. The Bayesian statistical analysis that was the subject of the evening's discussion was not prepared by a pathologist. They get into that. AVC and Dr. Quay welcomed any inputs from INR's epidemiologist. The former Assistant Secretary misunderstood a key point of the scientific discussion when he states, this statistical analysis is crippled by the fact that we have essentially no data to support key model inputs. Critically, we have no data on the vast majority of bat coronaviruses that exist in the wild. Carrying on, the former Assistant Secretary's identification of what is not known about the parthenogenic contents of the Chinese labs, while true, is totally irrelevant to the Bayesian approach, which focuses on what we do know, specifically what current evidence can be quantified and weighed. The former Assistant Secretary's RATG-13 straw man completely misrepresented AVC's findings. The former Assistant Secretary is mistaken if he is implying that AVC or any of the scientists would, quote, conclude laboratory escape, end quote, based on Dr. Quay's paper or any of the discussion. It should be noted that no panelist questioned the Bayesian approach. Either through misunderstanding of the moderator's instructions or on purpose, the former Assistant Secretary managed to, on multiple occasions, to sidetrack the panel discussions away from its scientific mission by interjecting comments and questions in violation of the ground rules under which the panel members agreed to participate in this event. Sounds an awful lot like Senate rules, right? Interesting. But you can't ask those questions. You're disobeying the rules. I object. Point of order. Over the past months, members of former Assistant Secretary Ford's staff and some AVC staff members warned AVC leadership not to pursue an investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Both AVC and ISN staff members stated that AVC would open a can of worms if continued. And let's see. I guess that is the conclusion of that. I'll read the last little bit here. It says, on January 7th, AVC was honored to host a scientific discussion involving several of the world's most accomplished experts in the field of biochemistry, molecular biology, zoonotic diseases, immunology, biological warfare, aerosol physics, and synthetic biology regarding the first substantive scientific Bayesian analysis of two COVID-19 origin hypotheses. They graciously devoted almost 3 hours of their time without compensation to help refine Dr. Quay's outstanding work, agreed to consider further refinement of his analysis, and are to be commended for these selfless contributions to get to the root causes of the global pandemic. And last but not least, some of the top-line points, this 8-pager here, United States government expert analyses on the WHO convened global study of the origins of SARS-CoV-2, Joint China World Health Organization report. This now backs up to April 5th of this year, 2021. Let's see, maybe I'll hit some of the high points of this. The top-line points, while the report includes some new relevant information potentially related to the origins of COVID-19, the report has not significantly improved our understanding of how the virus might have started circulating in Wuhan, which was called for in the study's terms of reference for the investigation. Conclusions made by the joint expert team lack raw data and or supporting information in the final report and annexes. In fact, some sections of the report appear to contradict or undermine conclusions in other parts of the report. The information and analyses presented in the report did not provide clear scientific support for any one hypothesis, and additional work is needed to identify the origins and circumstances leading to the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 in the hopes of reducing the probability of a similar event. The report does not provide substantive guidance for future investigations, such as prevention of new outbreaks, spillover events, design of studies of novel outbreaks of unknown origins, or lessons on treatments/risk factors for patients. So then they get into the methodology by bullet item here, some of the key findings. Let's see, report recommendations. USG expert analyses, main findings of working groups per epidemiology. Let's see. Without access to the raw data, it is difficult to understand the trends in respiratory cases before and during December 2019 and into January 2020. Let's see. Molecular epidemiology. Anything? Again, some highlights there. Animal and environmental studies they get into. Possible pathways of emergence, direct zoonotic transmission. And they, of course, state their position as part of those. Introduction through intermediate host, followed by zoonotic transmission. Again, their position. Introduction through the cold/food chain. Dedicated a pretty big section to that. There is no credible evidence presented in the report to support that it actually occurred. Interesting. Introduction through a laboratory incident. Again, there's their position. And recommendations for next steps. Maybe I'll read this last little closing point here. It says the lack of definitive conclusions in the report is not surprising, given the mandate of the team and the circumstances in interacting with the Chinese colleagues and the difficulty tracing the origins of emerging infectious diseases. On a positive note, the report summarizes a tremendous amount of data, published or unpublished, and provides reasonable and justified recommendations for second phase investigations. It also lays out many deficiencies, as well as needs for future investigations. Finally, it provides two likely, not surprising, scenarios for the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 in the human population. Future investigations should be more timely and better prepared with direct involvement of the team leading the investigation and countries/laboratories performing it. On a negative note, the report does not exclude any of the four scenarios or provide support for any scenario beyond what was known previously. There was no direct investigation into the scenario of a laboratory incident, something that the investigation was not set up to allow. One could view the support as a decent start into a second phase investigation. Future studies need to focus on broader searching for virus hosts. Example, expanding animal sample. More coherent hypotheses testing and specific targeted questions that refine details about the origins of the virus outbreak. Every recommendation for phase 2 work should specify joint review to ensure the WHO team has access to data it needs to conduct through thorough analyses. Identifying the source of an pandemic is not an easy task, and success is not a given. The biggest lesson learned from the investigation/report is that transparency and real-time information data sharing is key in the fight against infectious disease events of global dimension. It is also important to acknowledge that trying to do these origin studies after outbreaks, epidemics, pandemics start is never going to be easy. For many outbreaks, the source and spillover mechanism were not conclusively identified during or after the outbreaks, or the understanding of the origins came many years later. We must understand that expanded efforts to understand new pathogens and where they come from before there are widespread outbreaks is needed. Otherwise, we will continue to do the same thing over and over again. That is, wait until after outbreaks start while hoping for better results on sources of the pathogens. So, there you have it. Real quickly, in a nutshell, some of the letters and studies and whatnot, the memos, of course, that went back and forth in the article, highlighted here. So, again, if you read through this, take the time to listen to it for whatever we're into this now, better than an hour and 45 minutes into this. One of the things that stands out to me that is not mentioned, and that is this. October 2019, a little simulation that occurred called Event 201. Now, granted, that may not be within the scope, but it does beg the question, what did they know and when? And think of who is involved, right? You got Bill Gates, you've got John Hopkins involved, military folks, and various others, all just happen to be running a simulation all around this very same thing that is now played out for the better part of a year and a half. How did they know? What did they know? When did they know? Were they the purveyors of the leak? Were they the ones, perhaps behind some of the funding outside of the NHS and NIAID funding for EcoHealth? Will we see that via cables? Any back channel communications? I don't know. But to me, that would be another angle that has yet to probably be discovered, and one that I'm assuming we probably will not see, if ever. So, yeah, I kind of have to laugh when I read the end of the article and some of these things that say, we need to do a 9/11 style commission to get to the bottom of it. Now, I think drastic for the efforts net that they have put forth. The Anons net on the boards probably have dug and found as much stuff, and probably more credibly than what we will ever get by way of some government-sponsored report. So, that being said, appreciate you guys tuning in this afternoon for a little bit of a long read, but one that I thought necessary to help try and get to the bottom of this. Again, Vanity Fair, they've got a little bit of a slant, but nonetheless, I thought they did a fairly good job of laying it all out there and the way that they did. So appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll see you back on the next one. Take care. God bless, everybody.